I'm Michelle Weiner. I'm a partner at Control Risk in their Washington, D.C. office. I head the regulatory risk practice for Control Risk, which means I have a team of recovering attorneys like myself, forensic accountants, and former compliance officers that are working kind of across proactive and reactive matters for our clients. So the perspective that I'll bring to this panel is, unlike my panelists, which have very, very deep experience at their companies and industry-specific experience, I get to see risk assessments across clients of all sizes and across industries as well. I think if I've learned one thing when I think about risk assessments from preparing for this panel and talking with our fellow panelists, it's that they come in all kinds of sizes and variations. There is no one right way to conduct a risk assessment. What we'll hope to bring to you today is the panelist experience, the level of maturity of where their risk assessment process is, because it's a very wide spectrum of maturity across risk assessment activities. And we want this to be interactive. So we're not going to wait until the end to allow questions. So please, if you have a question as we're going, a raise of a hand. I'll keep an eye on the audience. We'd like to have your questions as we go along. I'm going to allow my fellow panelists to introduce themselves and give a little bit of perspective, industry size of the companies that they come from as well. Do you want to get us started?
Sure. Hi, I'm Bill Parkin. I work for Avaya. I'm their Chief Compliance Officer there. My background is I've been with Avaya for 22 years. I started out in their corporate security group. So my background is physical security, threat assessments on the security side, and then I got into investigations and then made the leap over to compliance, the compliance officer back in 2015. So just glad to be here, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm Stacy Hanna. I'm the Global Head of Compliance for Lonza. Not a lot of folks in the U.S. know Lonza. Lonza is a Swiss pharmaceutical biotech company. They're a public company in Basel, Switzerland. My team, some of whom are in the room today, we are the first compliance team that Lonza has had in its 122-year history. So my perspective is going to be from a build perspective. So if there's anybody in the room that's just starting to have a compliance program, I'm happy to kind of answer any questions around that. So, and the risk assessment for us that we did was our first ever risk assessment last year. So that will be where my perspective is coming from.
Hi, I'm Michael Sevi. I serve as the Deputy Chief Compliance Officer of Marsh and McLennan. We are an insurance and risk management consulting conglomerate. We have 4 different companies: Marsh, Guy Carpenter, Mercer, and Oliver Wyman. About 65,000 employees across 130 countries globally, and headquartered just a couple blocks to the west of here on 6th Avenue, 45th and 6th. We invested very heavily in our compliance program after about $1 billion settlement with then Attorney General Eliot Spitzer here in New York in the mid-2000s. And so I think, building on Stacy's comment, my perspective is probably the kind of post-incident compliance program, where it was very heavily invested in and built out following a pretty large and headline-grabbing at the time enforcement incident.
Thank you. So we're going to start with a little bit of a baseline, talking about the scope of what a risk assessment can look like. As you can see, we've got different industries, different size of organizations, different levels of maturity of the risk assessment processes, but we thought it would be really helpful to talk about what risks are being included within the risk assessments. And Bill, I'm going to ask you to start. I know you've done a lot of work with your security background. If you could give us a sense of how that's played into the compliance risk assessment work you're doing.
Right now, in terms of our risk assessment activities, one thing that we're really focused on is GDPR came along and codified kind of what you need to do from a legal requirement for information security. So there's a heavy focus on that in addition to the other compliance-related activities. And that's when you look at what the controls are that they've looked at in GDPR. They don't get specific, but they cite a lot of German data privacy rules that can be traced, that can link back to certain standards. And where my knowledge base has been helpful is, my experience in the physical security side and then I've got enough knowledge on the information security side in terms of securing information on networks and systems to be dangerous. So it allows me to ask the right questions. So, but that's kind of where we're focused now, particularly is, for those of you not familiar with Avaya, we make enterprise communications, and we are moving from on-prem site solutions to the cloud. So, and as we do that, we're going to be supporting our customers with regional data centers. And as you move that data off their site and onto our prem or our cloud that we're hosting for them, all sorts of rules and regulations come into play.
And Stacy, since you've got maybe the luxury and the curse of the blank piece of paper to start your risk assessment, how did you make decisions about what you were going to include? And can you talk to us a little bit about things you might have included that wouldn't be expected for this group to flow into your risk assessment?
Sure. So just to take a little polling, how many people have a program that's already in place versus, okay, most of the room. And then who's kind of starting up a program? Okay, so less folks. Okay. So my one thing on risk assessments is my department is a little bit unique in that we cover anti-bribery, anti-corruption globally, antitrust, and trade compliance. And I don't know that there's a ton of compliance programs that do that necessarily. At least my benchmark last year didn't seem to indicate that. So we had to cover a broad swath of both topic and geography, and also the fact that we had never done anything like this before. And I think with risk assessments, there's not really one way that you can do it, right? You can do a really high level risk assessment across all of your business units, across all geographies. You could do a geographical one in a certain department. There's no one right way to do it. I think you just need to be constantly doing them is the really important part. For us, because we never done one, I made the determination that I was going to do a very high level one across all of our entities, across all of our geographies, and across all of our business units. So slightly ambitious, but I wanted to get a baseline, at least at the top level, for doing that from the get-go instead of trying to segment it by geography. And now what we're doing is taking what we learned from that high-level one and then doing geographical and business unit deep dives. This year, we will do 2 geographical deep dives in all 3 of those topic areas, one in China, one in India. And that came out of the fact that we did a very high level one across all 3 of those topics to begin with. But there's not really one way to do it. I think you just have to look at, one of the biggest things you have to look at is what is the tolerance in your company, at least from the business side, in doing them. Because you need a lot of buy-in from the business and you need a lot of help from the business. And if you're not going to get that, you're not going to have great risk assessment results. So I think you need to assess a bunch of different factors before you can decide what type you're going to do.
And Michael, I think that we'd be remiss if we didn't spend a little bit of time as well talking about a compliance risk assessment that as its core is dealing with corruption risk. So I know you've spent a lot of time. Could you spend a little time on what you see as kind of evolution in that space, in particular, maybe some new trends?
Yeah. So about 2 years ago, we did a global corruption risk assessment across each of the 4 businesses that MMC owns and operates. So again, we're operating in about 130 countries, and what we tried to do was look at every single business unit within each country in which we're operating and assign it a corruption risk score rather, and then risk rank our entities globally. I think when I think about trends, to your question in particular, it's not necessarily a very recent trend, but if you look at the last 5 years or so, what you see is a clear consensus that an effective anti-corruption compliance program is built upon a foundation of a risk assessment. Right. So if you look at the DOJ, FCPA guidance, their manual, it is very clear that they say one-size-fits-all compliance program is generally ill-conceived and ineffective because too many resources are allocated to lower risk activity at the expense of higher risk activity. And they go on to say that they will provide meaningful credit to a compliance program that misses a lower risk activity because resources have been allocated to higher risk activities. Meaning they're saying, listen, they don't want you focused on the frivolous T&E that can be kind of the shiny object for so many compliance programs, right, in the anti-corruption space. They're focused on the tuna fish sandwich and the Diet Coke with the government official, maybe at the expense of spending time focusing more on third parties, right, where the dollar values are so much greater. You see the same thing from the UK. The UK Ministry of Justice's guidance that came out on the UK Bribery Act is very clear that they expect they expect companies to institute anti-corruption programs which are based on periodic, informed, and documented risk assessments, right? You see the same thing in the U.S. sentencing guidelines as well as in the OECD good practice guidance on internal controls, ethics, and compliance. So when you look to the enforcement agencies, the Department of Justice, the UK Ministry of Justice, when you look at the sentencing guidelines, and when you look at the OECD guidance, it's all very clear that the foundation of your anti-corruption program has to be a periodic, documented, and well-informed risk assessment. We can talk more about the way that we executed that on a global basis, but that's kind of the first foundational point I would make. The other thing, in terms of recent trends and emerging risks, I think there's no doubt that the movement of business communications away from email, which companies control, typically they can pull it, they can review it, to devices that the companies don't control, like Signal or WhatsApp, or other text messaging devices, where the employee or the creator of the business record can permanently delete them in a way that they actually can't or is very hard to do with the company email, is a major risk. And it's a risk in the corruption space, but it's a risk actually across the board in compliance programs, and it's firmly on the radar of the Department of Justice. So when I think of emerging risks or latest trends, I would probably point to the DOJ's attention to text messaging. But when I think more broadly about it, I would say that there's a clear consensus. You need to start your anti-corruption program with a firm risk assessment.
And if I can build on that, this isn't news to anybody in this room, but the regulatory guidance, I'll put in quotes, is that you have a risk-based program. You can't have a risk-based program until you know your risk, right? You can't just say, we're operating in X country, and so my risk is this. I'm a pharmaceutical company in heavy and APAC, so this is my risk. That's not what the regulators want to see, right? So you need to, and it's not because we're talking on this topic, but doing risk assessments and continuously doing them year on year is one of the most important, if not the most important thing that your program should have. It's something that you can't miss anymore. And we're going to talk a little bit later about where there's a trend, and it's even not moving away from, but one of the bigger trends as well that's happening is doing the risk assessments on your third parties. So not only yourself, but your third parties, and that's where the movement is. So you've got to have your program in place first and then kind of branch out. So it's really important that you're doing this.
So if we drill down just one level and we think about what does that risk assessment at a kind of nuts and bolts, what does an effective risk assessment really look like? So Stacey, you've already kind of talked about level of organization that you're conducting it at least at the headquarters level as a first decision. Bill and Michael, what about you? Are you looking at regional activities to feed into your risk assessment or even localized operations? How are you considering risk beyond kind of headquarters viewpoint and baking that into your risk assessments?
Yeah, so we definitely take into account the perspective of our regional councils, our regional heads of internal audit, our regional controllers, who are our big partners. I mean, I think Stacey already mentioned the partnership that you need to effectively execute a global, in our case it was a corruption risk assessment, but I think it's pretty universal. In addition to feeding in the perspectives of the local control and governance colleagues, when we sat down to actually risk rank each of our operations globally, we put heavy weight on the CPI. And the CPI has its critics, the Corruption Perception Index score. It's certainly not perfect, but at the end of the day, if you need an objective, defensible measure of jurisdictional risk, and we'll talk about the other factors that play into it, but that's certainly one of the biggest. The CPI is hard to beat as an accepted barometer of corruption risk. So I think for us, it was a combination of CPI scores, local perspective, and past findings from our own internal investigations and internal audit.
And for us, I mean, we kind of compartmentalize certain things are done in certain parts of the world. So our R&D hubs are like in India and Germany, and that's where the most of that goes on. So we factored that in. How we do business in the Middle East is different than how we do business in the United States. So we did factor in working with our regional councils to make sure that was there, and that was also factoring in CPI. So, we definitely wanted to get that regionalized flavor for it, because you can't have one size fits all when you're looking at global risk. We operate in 140 countries, so it was a little challenging.
And so beyond CPI score, in terms of measurable data that you can use to feed into your risk assessment, Michael, I'll start with you. Do you want to walk through some of those quantifiable measures that you can bake into that corporate level risk assessment beyond CPI?
Yeah, so I think, just to take a step back, so when you kind of define the objectives and the scope of again, we're just kind of using corruption risk assessment here as a model, but I think these principles apply much more broadly. What is the objective? What is the scope? So when we looked at it internally, we said we really wanted to assess corruption risk empirically. We wanted to put a heavy emphasis on the data, because at the end of the day, that is defensible, repeatable, scalable, and objective. And it's when we're going to make an argument for resources or for budgets, it's very nice to be able to put hard numbers in front of our business leadership. So we immediately had a bias towards an empirical approach. Similarly, on the corruption risk spectrum, we wanted to focus on traditional corruption, government-linked corruption. Commercial bribery is certainly a risk. It is a crime both in the U.S. and under the UK Bribery Act. But on the risk spectrum, I think, looking at the enforcement cases, there's no doubt that government-linked corruption is more frequently prosecuted, and it's much higher risk activity. So that right away draws you to a couple of data points that are going to be relevant to the analysis. Big picture, I think it breaks down to three kind of categories, right? Who you're doing business with, where you're doing business, and how you're doing business. Right? Who you're doing business with, where you're doing business, and how you're doing business. So when you think about who you're doing business with, this is where you want to try to quantify your number of government clients per country, the amount of revenue from government clients, both as a total absolute number as well as a percentage of that country's total revenue. So if 75% of your Chinese operations revenue is coming from government clients, that dependence on government revenue, I think, is an important attribute of the risk profile. So who you're doing business with a heavy emphasis on understanding where your government clients are and what types of government clients you have. Where you're doing business, that's where I would look at something like the CPI score, the revenue per country, the head count per country, the exposure to each country around the world, the amount of compliance officers present, if any. And then the operations themselves, how you're doing business. Are you using a large number of third-party introducers? Are any of those third-party introducers affiliated with governments? Or are they associated with introducing government business? The travel and entertainment spend, event sponsorships, charitable contributions, all of the ways that money flows out of the organization. And of course, the nice thing about money is that it's typically tracked with actual data, and the finance group is your biggest partner here when it comes to looking at the way money is spent, how it's spent, and who the recipients are. So big picture, I think it breaks down into those categories. Our profile, we're not moving goods across borders, right? We don't move products. It's a people business. Fundamentally, it's the insurance industry. So what is our risk profile going to be? Well, it's going to be gifts, travel, entertainment, event sponsorships, charitable contributions, third parties that we work with, and more recently, jobs, right? Hiring practices, especially hiring practices in Asia and the Middle East, where companies have gotten into trouble for hiring sons and daughters of government officials, right? But it comes down to kind of those 7 ways that corruption risk is going to manifest in our business. If you're moving goods across borders, you have all kinds of additional headaches. If you're building plants, you have licensing and other types of permitting, which create additional government touch points. But those are the data points that were most relevant to our analysis.
And so in addition to those quantifiable measures, how many of you are in your current risk assessment process baking in what I'll call more qualitative decision making into the numbers, what the numbers might tell you? Is anyone using qualitative factors in their risk assessments right now? Okay, interesting. So things that they're not easily measurable. So you have to make a call. There's judgment involved in how you consider that, into your risk assessment. And I see this as a movement. So once you've got the data, you're able to harness the data points that Michael has. Some of my clients that have very, very mature risk assessment processes are using qualitative factors. They're adding in things like compliance's assessment of the strength of management that you have in that particular country. It ultimately becomes a quantitative measure in your risk assessment, but it requires that someone to feed in and judge how that would get measured. It's not easily measurable like a number of distributors would be.
So a number of you have talked about different measures in place, and so there seems to be a confluence of inherent and residual risk here. Are you guys tracking that separately, or are you coming up with sort of one assessment based on where you are?
I can tell you, what we did is we started out with a framework that SCCE published, and then dovetailed over with the fraud tree from CFE as a starting point. And then we met with the business groups to say, hey, here's the we feel the universe of laws that are regulations that apply to your business. And it was interesting because when we got to the product house, they were very concerned about, what laws and regulations needed to, required certain functionality within the products. They weren't as concerned about fraud and things like that because there were controls in place for their particular business units to say, like finance was. But what we asked them to do to own the risk was they plotted it on a 2x2 graph, and it was just probability versus impact, and we defined those, and they agreed to what those were, and then we're going to be tracking for that progress. Anything up in that upper right quadrant has to come down, or we need to make sure that there's visibility to why it's up there and why it can't be mitigated, and that's going to require their executive committee member to sign off. Obviously, the general counsel will see it, the CEO will see it, but also I'll be presenting that to the audit committee. So at least there'll be visibility, but yes, we are trying to get that. We are looking at residual risk, like what's left over once business practices are factored in that try and keep us on the right side of the law. At least that's what we're doing.
Anyone have a different approach? No? So just to close the loop on the qualitative factors, some of the other things that I've seen that I found really interesting being incorporated into risk assessments recently are social media monitoring. So many of you might look at your own Glassdoor reviews as an example. So how disgruntled are employees in the particular operation that you're looking at from a risk perspective in terms of giving it a score? Is it a high number of negative postings about management, about the internal culture? We all struggle with how do you assess where your operations are from a cultural perspective, and I thought use of social media monitoring as a potential measure of that. And yes, there's always going to be a disgruntled employee who's going to make a posting which may not be accurate. We've all seen that, but I think the cadence of that type of reporting can be a useful metric to consider when you're assessing risk with one of your foreign or local operations as well. And another one that I just saw recently that I thought was very, very well done as well is consideration of political risk. So we've all seen actions recently in China, in Brazil, where you are questioning whether or not this is local government in a political year, in an election year, posturing about how they're going to be tough on corruption. We see this often in Latin America as well recently, and you wonder whether or not your risk of having regulatory action within that country might be elevated. It may only be a temporary elevation of that risk, but considering whether or not political action is likely to bake that as well as another qualitative measure into your risk assessment are just a couple of the things that I would ask you to consider once you get comfortable with harnessing your data and looking at those quantitative metrics. There are other kind of really unique ways to think about, refine, and nuance it based on your business and where you're doing business, as Michael suggested.
I think another thing that you can look at is what does your hotline tell you as well, right? What kind of trends are you seeing? Are you seeing a pattern of things around the country or the company that could be systemic? Are you seeing a pattern of allegations that pop in a certain region? And you can combine that with how strong is your management in that region? What's the political environment look like, right? You can kind of do a bunch of different qualitative and quantitative things to get yourself to where you need to be. But I find that sometimes the hotline data can be pretty interesting to look at, especially if you have great metrics around that like we do. And so we always take a look at that as well.
And I'm sorry,
You
go
have a
ahead.
Can you address whether you use outside third parties, or are you doing all of these risk assessments sort of internally, or are you, working with anyone on the outside to help you on this?
So I can answer that one. And it was one thing that I wanted to say. I think what's really important is to have your outside vendor who does help you with those. And I know that that's a cost analysis, right? And I don't think you have to use outside counsel or an outside vendor for every single one you do. We happen to have a really great partnership with a firm that we use and with an outside audit firm. And that depends on what region we're going into, right? What audit firm we use. I consistently use the same firm, but I use different audit firms. I think what's really important is to have that partnership with the outside along with what I talked about before, the inside partnership. What was interesting for us, and I don't know if everyone runs them this way, but we didn't just have partnership with people inside. We actually had the folks inside, outside of the compliance and legal team, assigned to doing the risk assessment. So not only did you have them heavily involved in conducting the risk assessment, they own the risk afterwards. So what I think is really important is that they understand how we got there. It's harder to do, right, to say I need your people's time up front, but I think in the long run, it's actually better when you try to operationalize and get some of the fixes and the remediations that you need to do if you've had people involved the entire time. So you just have to do a little political kind of maneuvering up front to get that. But I think that combination actually with outside and inside is really good.
You got your organization says ERM,
Mm-hmm.
and it runs out of a particular department. And you also have other functions who run different types of risk assessments. And you talked early on about getting buy-in. How does your risk assessment process and doing them continuously intersect or collaborate with these other risk assessments that you've done?
I think, were you going to talk about that a little bit, the
Yeah.
ERM side? I'll just briefly say, so my risk assessment is one risk assessment within the company in the areas that I own, right? And so what my risk assessment does is then feeds into the broader ERM context. But ERM obviously is broader than my three areas, so we will just feed our information into them, and then they'll risk rank across the whole company, how much or how elevated my risk is versus the entire process. I think, right, you were going to talk a little bit about that too?
We're in a very similar space. I think when we initiated ours, we had to be clear that it was a compliance risk assessment about the business complying with the laws that were applicable to each operation. I got a lot of pushback and a lot of questions to make sure that it was not ERM, and I think that's just culturally within my company, they've struggled to get their arms around something that's meaningful and tractionable when it comes to ERM. So in the past, when they've gone through that exercise, there was buy-in and support for it, and a lot of effort went into the reporting when it went up to the audit committee. But what they found is it never remained focused. So I talk to my internal auditor every week, and we catch up on what's going on in his world and my world. He knows that we're doing this, and we'll dovetail that together in a manner where it's captured where it needs to be captured, but we're trying to figure that out in a meaningful way. But like he's aware of the headwinds that he has in trying to just keep his ERM program focused and not wasting people's time. And then he realized, I've got support from mine, but he doesn't want to get in there and ruin it. So it's work in progress, but it was definitely a headwind for us in terms of getting people to step up to the plate. Because I took a model similar to what Stacy did of getting the business unit owns these. So we're, not the compliance organization, not the legal organization. We're guiding them and we're helping them assess where it goes on that graph. But they know they own it, and it's going to, I'm hoping to get it into their objectives each year because that's going to be our life cycle.
I think that's a good point, though. I think with the internal audit, with the ERM, I think you need to be out talking to your head of IA. You need to be out talking to whoever owns ERM if it's not you, and making sure that you guys aren't going this way, right? Because there's a lot of crossover in if internal audit's not conducting and helping you with your risk assessment, which ours does not, then they're going to be doing a bunch of things. You should be reviewing what findings they have, right? That's another thing that you can feed into your risk assessment. What has internal audit been doing? What have they found, right? You want to go and look and talk to ERM and make sure that everybody's aligned in what they're doing. I think that's really, really important, or you're just going to have a ton of crossover.
And Stacy's tasked it with the business, but I know that there are lots of compliance departments that are tasked with ownership of the risk assessment process, and you have to find those internal stakeholders that are going to help you get the data you need to be able to perform it. And if you're not necessarily into creating math algorithms to analyze those quantitative factors that we've talked about, I think that it is really important to leverage internal audits methodology if they're doing a risk assessment. I haven't ever found that ERM is at a level deep enough to really assist at that kind of more targeted, focused compliance risk assessment, but you'll need help from data experts and finance stakeholders potentially in-house just to harness the data to be able to run the risk assessment if you're going to try and do it in-house rather than use an outside vendor as well. Those are some of the biggest challenges that we see clients struggle with, is how do I get the data that I need to be able to actually perform the risk assessment that I want to. So let's talk about action. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Quick question. Do you have, with regard to compliance audits specifically, are there any, can you talk a little bit about any ideas about attorney-client privilege? Do you care about that? Is that something that you try to maintain as you're doing it internally?
So I think you perfectly kind of segued to what we want to talk about. Like, what does an action coming out of your risk assessment look like? If you're going to do site visits at local operations, who should be involved in those? What do they look like? And I've seen clients do it with outside counsel's involvement, so they are conducting an underprivilege under a very kind of conservative posture and approach. And I've seen other clients that are using their in-house counsel to be, that's where the reporting goes first, coming out of the risk assessment when you're doing it local on the ground. What I think some of my clients have found when you're actioning a risk assessment at a local operation, you want to get good and valuable information. And to do that, if you send a bunch of lawyers in, it tends to look really, really scary to the local operations, and they're going to want to tell you less rather than tell you more. And so how do you facilitate that conversation without also increasing your legal risk? And that requires balance of knowing where you're doing the site visit, kind of how exposed have they been to a regulatory environment that would have an expectation that you'll be doing things like looking at transactions, conducting interviews, conducting surveys, so that you really are getting valuable information out of your operation. So I think it depends on the risk tolerance when it comes to privilege and legal risk that the entity that you're working within has in terms of making decisions about how they're going to do their site visits. I don't know if you guys have also done that calculus before you've gone out and gone on site?
Yeah, it's always a consideration, more so in the U.S. than elsewhere. But, we did end up bringing in an outside vendor to assist with the process. It was not a law firm. But after we had all of the data that we needed across the different areas that I outlined earlier, across the who we're doing business with, where we're doing business, and how we're doing business, we had a ton of data, which was of varying quality and consistency, widely varying. And so it did require some outside expertise. In our case, not from a law firm, but from one of the big four accounting firms who really helped us to come up with a risk ranking formula, which then assigned risk weights to the different levels of data, kind of by plotting it out almost on a bell curve for each of the data points. So, your riskiest 10% have this number, and your riskiest 10% have this level of government interaction, because it's all relative, right? So you do need to kind of plot it out and then draw lines as to where the different, tranches of risk would be. So that got a little fancy from my perspective, right? Being a lawyer who's not mathematically inclined, that was, it was pretty fancy actually. And the spreadsheets they created were phenomenal. But because we did all the legwork ourselves, their engagement was very limited and tight, and it was really about applying the math to the numbers to help us risk rank. So it was not done by a law firm, but it was invaluable to creating the global report that we ultimately published.
So we talk about.
Yeah.
There's another question.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
What is your cycle for doing one of these from start to finish.
Yeah.
Maybe break it down from start till you get the results and you've analyzed them. And then you have the whole remediation part. How long then do you give the business to come back to you with their plans? And I realize that's going to be an ongoing monitoring because, you know, as Bill said, we want to see it go down on your heat map and whatnot. But what's your cycle time?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a little bit of a contrarian, I think, when it comes to risk assessments. I think that they're incredibly important, but I think that there's diminishing marginal returns, right? Like the exercise that I've outlined for you guys was incredibly difficult and time-consuming, and it took months and months and months. But it led to a series of very targeted next steps, which is a little more sensitive than I should probably get into here. But the point is, it took us about 9 months, start to finish, for us to have a report, which we ultimately sent to the audit committee and business leaders, which was also accompanied by a PowerPoint presentation that I delivered until I was blue in the face. But the reason why I say I'm a bit of a contrarian is because then there was a desire to do yet more risk assessment and go further with regional risk assessments. And again, I just think there are diminishing marginal returns. At some point, you kind of have to get on with the remediation. So, and also that was something that I was picking up from the executives, because initially I did have a targeted deep dives in our highest risk jurisdictions as a next step. Seems logical, right? And from a compliance perspective, it was. But from the business perspectives, they were like, what more do you need to know? Like, you know, the risk assessment isn't the thing. The risk mitigation is the thing. So get on with it, man. Like, what are you waiting for? Go. So that's why I say, you know, the risk assessment took about 9 months, and then we built action, which went into the next year. But those actions were not about further assessment. They were about actual controls. They were about training. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and ours was about a year from start to finish. And if they're ever really finished, right? There never are. But I think that's seems like a pretty good timetable. I would have liked it to be shorter, but but again, mine was a little unique. First one, super high level, right? Super broad. So I think I would like to, ideally, from a cycle perspective, do something that is like that every 2 to 3 years. Now, that just depends on what our deep dives look like. That depends on what the remediation looks like, and that depends on whether I get the business buy-in to do that.
And we're in the same boat. I mean, we viewed quarterly meetings to see if we could get movement on the high-risk items, and then either probably, you know, start over with just an assessment of the landscape due to changes in the business and the legal requirements. Probably we were hoping for annually. That's probably too aggressive. So it's probably going to be every 18 months to 2 years. Yeah. You know.
Well, that's a good point too. So if your business is in acquisition mode or divestiture mode, either one, your business changes constantly, right? So it's not just, and you have to constantly keep up with that risk. So what this year I may say, this is what I think the biggest risk is and this is where we're going. It will depend on what my M&A group probably does and where we could have higher risk. And so that's why I think having them continuously, and again, not just because the DOJ says we should have them continuously, because your risk is constantly changing. The business is moving to a new region, new product, you're buying new companies, selling companies. It seems to change all the time these days. So
figuring out that cadence of being able to update your risk assessment, I think coming out of your actions, so making sure it doesn't become a static thing that you do once and then you move into remediation and now you have to repeat, you're going to do it again and move into your operationalizing it, but keeping that a constant flow so that when you're doing site visits and you learn something new about your risk, going back and refining the model, real time.
Just a follow-up. Has any of you done, for example, year one, you do the anti-corruption, and then that takes you on a cycle, and maybe you don't repeat anti-corruption for another couple of years, or maybe you have an acquisition that has nothing to do with it. But then maybe year two, you do the whole thing around trade control compliance, and year three around whatever other area you might feel is potentially vulnerable. Has any of you done that, or are you strictly kind of anti-corruption in your assessment?
So my assessment was across all three, antitrust, as well as trade and anti-bribery, because that's what my department owns. I didn't segment that by topic. I went across all three, and when I do my deep dives this year regionally, it'll be across all three areas as well. And that's partly because of the ownership factor there, that my department's responsible for those. But I don't, break them out. Are you guys responsible for outside of anti-corruption in your practices, or?
We want to make sure they're doing what they're doing, but it's in the legal department as a whole, and I'm in the legal department. But we're taking a very similar approach. The business groups that have that risk highlighted, I think from my perspective, it can't be a one and done. You want to make sure that if the regulator knocks and you show them, hey, I did my risk assessment and the last one was done in 2016, but here's the follow-up. Because when they see 2016, they're going to say, that's stale. Thanks for playing. But if you show, well, here's what we were doing before we're going to do it again, I would imagine if you had a good explanation, a good show forward progress on the risk mitigation, it might be acceptable, it might not, but you've got to assess that.
And we started with corruption, but so we do have a dedicated subject matter expert who kind of owns sanctions. And she was very, it sparked some good competitiveness within the functions, because she then did her own kind of similar risk assessment the next year. So it wasn't a master plan, it was somewhat organic, but it did spark similar efforts across different subject matter experts.
Go ahead. For those of you who did it more in-house on your own, or at least the basics, how did you staff that? I know some of you said you utilized people in the different markets, but how did you organize it? Did you have one person who was acting as sort of a project manager, and what did it look like over the course of that year to make sure that things continued to move?
So I have a ton of resources available to me. I'm like everybody in the room. No. So I have the ability to task the regional attorneys when I need help. So it's not a dotted line reporting relationship, but I talk to their VP. I tell her what I'm looking to do, and then we went out and did that. So yes, I had one person project managing it. I was involved in facilitating the conversations with leadership, and once they identified the people within their organizations that were going to own it, we then brought in the regional attorneys or the product, that depends, because we have regionals from a sales commercial perspective, and then we have, product attorneys, and then it depends on what risk we're looking to mitigate. But, they had their kind of seat at the table from a guiding perspective so that we could do it right. We're still diving into it, so I don't know if we're going to continue to do it in-house, if there's benefits to go external with it. I think it's definitely work in progress, particularly, like I said, as the business changes. And ours, depending on what you're in, Stacy mentioned mergers and acquisitions. Our big thing is, as we move from one business model to the cloud, that takes us from just a telecommunications company to a service provider. Whole different set of regulations come into play right there. So, it's work in progress. But would I love to be able to get outsourced help? Absolutely. But it's a matter of, one, this is important, they want it done, and within our budget, we made it a priority where we assign the internal resource. In a year or two, maybe I'll get funding and get some help, which would be really nice.
If you have a compliance champion network, do a lot of folks in the room have I don't know if everybody calls it that, it's not my favorite term, but that's another way that you could go as well if people take that program really seriously, which some companies do. I know I've heard recently, actually, there's some companies where it's like competitive to be in the compliance champion program. We're not one of them yet, but we hope to be there. Right? It's pretty interesting. So they're another group that you could ask if they're very active and want to be helpful, because they can actually help shepherd that in the regions as well. One of the other big things I think is really helpful is if you actually get the senior leadership in the countries as well. So if you have GMs at the site level that you can start to partner with and get their buy-in and their help, a lot of the times they'll actually task people. And if your GM in your country is asking you to do it, they do it a lot quicker than if I'm calling and asking them to do it. So I think if you can have a good relationship with, depending on how you're structured, you can also utilize those folks as well. And I think that people take it really seriously if it's the head of the region that's asking.
So once you've completed that risk assessment and you've got your findings now, you've gone through however long your process is, I'll ask the panelists to talk a little bit about how you're actioning coming out of those findings. So how are you making decisions? You've got top 5 risks, top 5 locations driving that risk perhaps. What are you doing? What are the steps you're taking to action the findings from the risk assessment?
I'm happy to share some high-level thoughts. So, I think like a lot of things in compliance, it comes down to policies, monitoring, training, financial controls, right? You know, the same basic program elements that you see across the spectrum. So for us, it was a combination of putting in place a few new reviews, compliance reviews across a couple different business processes where we thought that was a meaningful risk mitigant. And then we did some targeted training. So we ended up training about 12,000 people globally who we identified through this process as having exposure to government clients. But we bifurcated that. We did about 2,000 people live in our highest risk regions. So I personally traveled and did a lot of that. And it's obviously more high impact, it's more memorable, it's more personable, and you're more likely to get real stories and real anecdotes out of people of things that they're dealing with, and then the follow-up calls. So for 2,000 people, we did live training, and then we did a video-based training for the additional 10,000. And it was very easy to justify like why we were taking this approach, and of course all the spend with all the travel and everything was no longer a matter of opinion. We had a lot of hard data to back it up. Incidentally, I will add that although like scrubbing the data and pulling it all together was a horrendous pain, and the way we did it, just to address that prior question, was we had a steering committee which was all relatively senior people, like the head of internal audit, the head of controllership, the global controller, all of the regional leaders of compliance, and then we had an operating committee made up of people who mostly were the direct reports of the folks on the steering committee, both of which met regularly, all of which was project managed. We ended up with some of the best data anywhere in our company on our government client profile and who's working with government clients and which government clients we have and how much revenue each one generates, better than the people who are the leaders of the public entity practice had. And I ended up getting calls from some of these people like, hey, I hear you've got really good data on all our government clients. Like, I need that, you know. And of course, they struggle with the same things we struggle with. You know, what's in Salesforce is spotty and inconsistent, and people aren't using the marketplace system they're supposed to use, and all those problems. So, incidentally, we ended up having some of the best data. But look, I mean, I think one of the most tangible things that I can share was the way we approached training the following year and the way we bifurcated it between the higher risk folks and the rest of the population.
And Stacey, I know you're planning to go on the ground in China, and I think it's one of the biggest missteps that I see coming out of risk assessments is not going local. So not actually performing follow-up procedures on the ground. And certainly those supplier audits, as we've talked about, and reviewing your third parties, like actually going and meeting with them, testing in their books and records, looking at controls, compliance culture is a trend. You know, you've all had audit rights probably for a long time in your third-party partner contracts, but how many people are executing against them? Actually using those, unless there's a big problem. We've seen a real uptick in that activity for clients, just routine visits to third-party partners, using that audit clause. And I know that's part of your activities in China as well. Could you talk a little bit about what you're going to do when you're on the ground?
Sure. So for us, Lonza's B2B, right? So our biggest risk is our third parties, our agents, our distributors. That's just our biggest risk across the world. And so in assessing going in and doing a deep dive in China of Lonza China and all of the facilities there, I decided that at the same time we should cover, from a risk basis, our biggest risk. And so we have geographical risk in China, and then we have our third-party risk in China. So what we're going to do is combine our deep dive risk assessment in China of our own facilities with a deep dive risk assessment of our highest risk agents and distributors in that region at the exact same time. So I'm not sure how that's going to work yet. We don't have it fully laid out, and I haven't told my GM in China yet, so don't let him know. But that's happening. We have a date at the end of the year, and that's what we're going to do. We just thought it's going to be a lot of work to do both, but because I have both a blessing and a curse of starting a program, I really want to start the program so that we're also conducting those third-party audits. That is really what I'm seeing as one of the biggest trends right now, is making sure that you're utilizing those audit rights and that you're actually doing those if they're your highest risk.
Question for you. You mentioned before that sometimes you'll do like the third party as sort of a phase 2. When you're doing your initial risk assessment, you know, I would think that sometimes the vendors that you use or third parties that you're using are contribute to your own internal risk level. So how deep do you go? Do you just identify, okay, we're using third parties in these categories and then stop there? in sort of phase one and then you kind of explore further, or how did you think about that?
So for us, we actually just implemented our program on our third-party assessment and our diligence and monitoring of third parties. So we're just at a baseline with that. But from the risk assessment process, I'll say that when third-party risk did pop for us, that's as far as we went, right, with respect to those. And then in deciding to do our deep dive, then of course, then we'll pull out what those highest risks will be. And of course, for us, it's China and India right now, and then we'll assess those. But yeah, we didn't go any further with the third parties. But again, because we did something very high level, I think it just depends on what kind of risk assessment you're doing.
We did a little deeper on our third parties, so we actually have somebody that's dedicated to what we call brand protection, but they do the right to audit because we use partners and distributors as well. And when they use an AI program to monitor the sales data to look at it for outliers, and when they find them, they do the audit to look for special discounts and things like that, and and invoke the right to audit. And it's actually been very positive. It was very painful at first. The business didn't want to do it because they said, "Oh, you're upsetting the channel." And now that he's been able to show that he's stabilized pricing in different regions just due to diversions and stopping gray market. And then we were actually able to recover a bunch of revenue. So, once you peel the Band-Aid off, it will get better. At least in our case, it did.
So we are literally almost out of time. We have just a couple of minutes. We could take one more question if there's another one from the group.
How are you determining, I'm going to take you all the way back, how are you determining that something is risky? So for us, we have a survey, I don't know who started this survey, but same questions every 3 or so years that we ask. What are you guys doing to determine, looking at the business and see this is a risk?
I could start. I think we started with that framework that we downloaded from SCC, and we looked at the CFE fraud tree, and we presented that to them and said, hey, how are these relevant to your business? It was about an hour and a half call with two people that were deputized by their VP. And then they actually, reworded the risk. Like, we did take a shot at drafting it based on our familiarity with the business. I've been there 22 years. The gentleman that works for me has been there 16 years, and he's got a really strong background in internal audit. But they edited that, and that became their risk universe. And then they, they just rated it, and we just wanted it simple on a 2x2 of, impact versus likelihood, with the goal of just, you're going to need to get an objective to get those down or explain with visibility on why it's still up there. So, because you can't mitigate every risk. You want to try, but sometimes it's not possible.
But I think the other logical starting point is what laws apply to the business, right?
Yes.
And for multinational U.S.-based corporations, there's so many of the same laws, right? Between corruption, antitrust, and sanctions, like right away, from a legal risk perspective, if you're operating across borders, or if you're in a global company, like, you've got to have programs for each of those three. Depending on your business, money laundering may or may not be a higher or lower risk. But it fundamentally, I think, starts with the law, the legal requirements that govern your business, and then how those can manifest within your operations.
And that framework hits that.
Yeah.
Like, it's actually bringing the laws. It was an
yeah.
Excel sheet. Like, it was a gold mine to find. To be very honest with you, because I'm not an attorney, so it saved me from pestering my colleagues. It was able to go with them with validation, which they appreciated.
So we're at time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
For
Thank you.
participating.